The moment I walked into the courtroom, my mother laughed, a quiet, sharp sound that sliced through my ribs. My father just shook his head, a familiar gesture of disappointment, as if he'd already accepted my defeat. They didn't realize I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there to end them legally, publicly, and permanently. By the time the judge's gavel struck and the words, "Case dismissed," echoed through the chamber, the empire they had built on my name was already turning to ash. My name is Clara Jensen, and I am 38 years old. The polished oak doors of the Harwood County Courthouse swung shut behind me with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the hall. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old paper, lemon-scented floor polish, and the faint, metallic tang of stale coffee. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the tall, arched windows, striping the marble floors in bars of pale gold and shadow. It felt less like a hall of justice and more like a cathedral where sacrifices were made. In my right hand, I carried my offering, a 400-page, 3-ring binder, its weight a dense, comforting anchor in a world that had become unmoored. Each page was a carefully catalogued piece of my life, a testament to silent injuries and calculated betrayals. This binder was not a shield. It was a sword, forged over 16 years in the cold. Blue light of a computer screen. My gaze swept the room, instantly finding them in the front row, positioned for maximum visibility as the aggrieved parties. My mother, Vivian, sat ramrod straight, her silver blonde hair coiffed into a perfect, immovable helmet. She was dressed in a Chanel suit the color of cream, a string of pearls resting on her collarbone like a delicate yoke. As her eyes met mine, a small, knowing smile played on her lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth or encouragement. It was the smile of a spectator at a particularly amusing play, a dismissive, condescending curve of the mouth that said, "Look at this little girl, playing dress-up in a grown-up's world." It was the same smile she'd given me when, at 10, I'd presented her with a clay bird I had painstakingly sculpted, its wings slightly lopsided. She'd patted my head and murmured, "Charming," before placing it on a back shelf where it gathered dust until it was quietly discarded. I felt the old, familiar sting, a phantom limb of childhood hurt, but I didn't let it show. Today, that smile was a miscalculation. She was watching the wrong play. Beside her, my father, Douglas, was her perfect opposite. Where she was rigid and sharp, he was soft and collapsing inward, dressed in a somber gray suit that seemed a size too large for his thinning frame. He didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze was fixed on his own hands, clasped loosely in his lap. He gave a single, slow shake of his head, a gesture of profound, weary disappointment. It was not a condemnation of my actions, but an acceptance of what he saw as an inevitable, tragic outcome. He was the former CEO of Jensen Dynamics, a titan of industry in our small city, a man whose photograph had once graced the cover of business journals. Now, he looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own legacy, a man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life in his wife's shadow. A flicker of something pity, perhaps threatened to soften the hard knot in my stomach, but I crushed it. Pity was a luxury I had burned away months ago, along with every photograph I owned of the three of us together. There was no lawyer at the plaintiff's table beside me. The polished wood was empty save for my binder and a single, slim glass of water. I hadn't hired one. The omission was intentional, a calculated move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. A lawyer would have sought compromise, would have spoken in terms of settlements and reconciliation, but I wasn't here to negotiate. Reconciliation was impossible. This wasn't a dispute. It was a demolition. By standing alone, I was making a statement. This is personal. This is a debt that can only be paid by the debtor, to the creditor. In full view of the world they so meticulously curated, I was the one who had filed the petition. I was the one who had checked every box, cited every precedent, and delivered the summons myself to the security guard at the gates of our family estate. I was the plaintiff, the prosecutor, and the sole witness to the crimes they thought were buried in the bedrock of their success. A sharp rap of a gavel cut through the low murmur of the gallery. A bailiff's voice, loud and monotone, commanded, "All rise." The shuffling of feet and scraping of chairs filled the air as the Honorable Judge Marian Albright took her seat, her black robes a stark void against the rich mahogany of the bench. She was a woman known for her impatience with theatrics and her sharp legal mind. I had counted on that. Her voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, filled the chamber. "We are here to hear Case 2047 CJ, Jensen versus Jensen." Jensen versus Jensen. The words hung in the air, a stark, clinical summary of a lifetime of quiet warfare. In that moment, I felt the collective weight of every gaze in the room pivot and settle upon me. I could almost hear their thoughts, the whispers of the city's elite, the family friends, the former employees who sat scattered in the public gallery, the traitor daughter, the ungrateful child, biting the hand that fed her a silver spoon. What kind of person sues their own parents? I kept my spine straight, my eyes fixed on the judge, letting their silent condemnation wash over me. They saw a family drama. They had no idea this was a corporate execution. Then I felt a cold draft on the back of my neck, as if a window had been opened to a winter sky. I didn't need to turn to know its source. It was the chill that radiated from my mother. Her voice, a venomous whisper meant only for the ears of those in her immediate vicinity, but sharp enough to carry, slithered into my consciousness. "She won't dare." It wasn't a prediction. It was a command, the final exertion of a lifetime of assumed authority. It was the voice that had told me my dreams were impractical, my opinions were naive, my contributions were simply my duty. It was the voice of a queen who could not fathom a rebellion within her own castle walls. A faint, involuntary smile touched my lips, a sliver of ice. I angled my head just slightly, enough for her to see the expression, and mouthed my reply into the silent, watchful air of the courtroom. "I already did." On the table before me, the binder lay open. Its contents were a silent refutation of everything they believed. It wasn't just a collection of grievances. It was a meticulously constructed legal trap. Inside were photocopies of invoices I had processed, internal emails they thought had been deleted from the company servers, and sworn affidavits from 2 former IT technicians who had been ordered to scrub my name from project metadata. But the heart of it, the document upon which their entire empire would pivot and collapse, was tabbed in stark red. It was a copy of my original employment contract from 2011, a standard document they had presented to me with a flourish and a lecture on family loyalty. They had never bothered to read the fine print, but I had, and tucked away in the appendices, dismissed as boilerplate legal jargon, was a single, beautiful paragraph, Clause 19B, ownership of unregistered code. A clause so obscure, so rarely invoked, that their high-priced corporate lawyers had likely skimmed right over it. It was the bomb they had unknowingly placed in their own foundations 16 years ago. And my finger was on the detonator. I looked from my mother's narrowing eyes to my father's bowed head, and finally to the impassive face of the judge, the quiet hum of the room, the scent of old wood, the weight of the binder under my hand. It all coalesced into a single moment of absolute, chilling clarity. The life I had known was over. The family I had once tried to protect was an illusion. This morning, in this cold, sunlit room, everything would be broken, and from the wreckage, something new, something entirely my own would finally be built. This was not just a court case, it was a reclamation. The rustle of paper from the judge's bench was the only sound in the courtroom. Judge Albright was reading my initial petition, her expression unreadable. I kept my posture rigid, my hands resting on either side of the heavy binder, but in my mind, I was drifting. My gaze fell upon my mother, her composure as flawless as ever, and an image surfaced from the past, glossy and perfect. It was the cover of Harwood Elite Families from a decade ago, the Jensen family. The headline read, "Building a Modern Dynasty." There we were, the three of us, posed in the manicured gardens of our estate. My father stood behind my mother, one hand on her shoulder, a forced, paternal smile on his face. My mother was seated, the matriarch on her throne, radiating a cool, controlled power, and I was perched on the arm of her chair, 19 years old, wearing a cashmere sweater that itched and a smile that felt like it would crack my face. The article inside praised us as the pinnacle of community and commerce. It lauded my father's financial acumen and my mother's visionary leadership. It painted a portrait of a perfect family, a seamless union of love and enterprise. I remember the photographer telling me to look at my mother with admiration. I remember the feeling of her hand on my back, her fingers pinching slightly, a silent command to sit up straighter, to smile wider, to perform. That performance had been the central project of my entire life. Vivian Jensen's philosophy on child-rearing was as concise as it was chilling, a quote she'd given proudly to the journalist from that very magazine. I can still see the words in glossy print, set beneath a photo of her cutting a ribbon at a new hospital wing. "We don't raise daughters," she had said, her public smile gleaming. "We raise legacies." It sounded so noble, so forward-thinking, but a legacy is not a person. It's an asset. A daughter can have her own dreams, her own path. An asset has a designated function. My function was decided for me long before I understood what it meant. My father, a genius with spreadsheets and risk assessment, was the architect of the company's financial skeleton. He could make money multiply in ways that seemed like magic, but he was terrified of confrontation, of the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion. That was my mother's domain. As head of human resources and operations, she was the company's soul, and she ruled it with a velvet-gloved iron fist. She knew every employee's name, their spouse's name, their children's birthdays. She sent lavish gift baskets and remembered anniversaries. This was perceived as warmth, as genuine care. I knew it for what it was: data collection. She managed people by managing their attachments, their weaknesses, and their ambitions. She was a master strategist, and the company, Jensen Dynamics, was her chessboard. And then there was me. At 22, with a degree in computer science I had pursued because it was deemed practical, I was ushered not onto the executive track, but down into the building's brightly lit, climate-controlled basement. I was assigned to the IT department. To them, it was a support role, a place for the gears and wires that made the real work upstairs possible. They didn't understand what I did, and that suited them perfectly. I was the ghost in the machine, the silent, dutiful daughter, ensuring the family legacy ran without a hitch. My first major project was to design a proprietary logistics and cost control system from the ground up. I poured my life into it for 18 months. I worked through nights and weekends, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the quiet thrill of creation. I built something elegant and powerful, a neural network for the company that streamlined everything from supply chain management to payroll, saving them millions in its first year of implementation alone. I was proud. For the first time, I felt I had truly contributed something of value, something that was uniquely mine. When the system, codenamed Argent, was rolled out, it was met with company-wide praise. At the quarterly meeting, my father gave a speech about our commitment to efficiency. The internal memo announcing its success credited its development to an anonymous staff coder. Not my name, not even my department, just a ghost. I waited a week, assuming it was an oversight. When nothing changed, I gathered my courage and went to my mother's office. It was a corner suite on the top floor. With a panoramic view of the city I could only see from the server room's grimy window. I remember holding a printout of the source code's opening lines, where my name was clearly commented as the author. "Mom," I began, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. The memo about Argent. It didn't mention my name. She looked up from a stack of personnel files, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She removed them slowly, a gesture that meant I was about to be taught a lesson. "Clara, what are you asking for?" "Credit," I said. my courage returning. Authorship, I built it. My name should be on it. She sighed, a soft, disappointed sound. She stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at her kingdom. Jensen Dynamics is a family company, she said, her back to me. Everything we do for the good of the family, for the good of the name. Your father and I don't put our individual signatures on every decision. Do we? We are all Jensen. The name is the credit. She turned, her eyes fixing me with that familiar, soul-withering pity. Family doesn't need signatures, darling. Wanting one is, well, it's a bit petty. Don't you think? It suggests you see yourself as separate from us. The accusation hung in the air. You are not a team player. You are selfish. I was silenced. The argument was so perfectly crafted, so emotionally manipulative, that to fight back would be to admit to the very selfishness she was accusing me of. I left her office that day with the printout still in my hand, feeling ashamed for wanting the one thing I had earned. That was the day I learned that in my family, love and loyalty were tools used to enforce compliance. I retreated back to my basement, and for 16 years, I worked in silence. I continued to build, to innovate, to perfect the digital heart of their company. My code was in everything, from our client-facing interfaces to our internal security protocols. Every year, my work saved them more money, made them more efficient, and solidified their reputation as industry leaders. And every year, at the annual Harwood Business Gala, my father would walk onto the stage to accept the Jensen Innovation Award. He would thank his incredible team. He would thank his brilliant wife, and he would look out at the applauding crowd with a humble smile. I would watch from a table in the back, seated with the other anonymous staff, clapping along with everyone else, a ghost at my own feast. For a long time, I told myself it was enough. It was for the family. Preserving that glossy image from the magazine cover felt like a sacred duty. Their success was my success. I reasoned, their stability was my stability. I convinced myself that my silent, unacknowledged contribution was a form of noble sacrifice, the ultimate act of filial loyalty. I buried my own ambitions and told myself that keeping the peace, maintaining the facade of the perfect Jensen family, was a higher calling. I was a fool. I was a willing participant in my own erasure. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday in March. I was running a late-night diagnostic when I stumbled upon a restricted folder on the executive server, a folder my security clearance shouldn't have been able to access. A glitch in a recent update had left it momentarily vulnerable. Inside was the deal of a lifetime, the preliminary acquisition contract with Alder & Knox, a massive tech conglomerate. Jensen Dynamics was being sold. I scrolled through the hundreds of pages of legalese, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. And then I found it. Appendix C, Digital Assets. There it was. My life's work, Argent, and every other system I had ever built, listed and itemized. They had even given it a new, marketable name, the Jensen Operating System Suite. It was valued at $420 million. It was the single most valuable asset in the entire company. I scanned the document, my eyes flying across the page, searching for a name, for a mention, for anything. And then I saw the line for lead developer. It was followed by a single, stark, empty space. My 16 years of work, my entire professional existence, had not just been anonymized, it had been deleted. They weren't just selling my code, they were selling a fiction where I had never existed at all. That was the unforgivable thing. It wasn't about the money, it was about the cold, methodical way they had curated the story of their success by writing me out of it completely. They hadn't just taken credit for my work. They had taken my work and orphaned it, presenting it to the world as if it had sprung fully formed from the ether of Jensen innovation. They had taken my legacy and were selling it as their own. In their eyes, I wasn't their daughter. I wasn't even an employee. I was a ghost who had conveniently left behind a $400 million haunting. They had sold me, not as a person, but as a number on a balance sheet, a number with no name attached. And in that silent, sterile server room, the daughter they had raised died, and an entirely different kind of legacy was born. The hum of the server racks was a familiar lullaby, a sound that had been the backdrop to my life for 16 years. But on that night, it sounded like a slow, ticking clock. On my screen, illuminated in the cold, blue-white light of the otherwise dark room, was the document that would end my life as I knew it, the 800-page technical prospectus for the sale of Jensen Dynamics to Alder & Knox. My access to this level of the server was a fluke, a temporary security oversight I'd stumbled upon during a system diagnostic. It was like a god had accidentally left the door to my own personal hell ajar. I scrolled through financial projections, asset valuations, and market analyses, my mind a cold, efficient machine processing data. Then I reached Appendix C, the list of digital assets, and there it was, the Jensen Operating System Suite, a bland corporate title for the ecosystem of code that I had bled for. Next to it was the valuation, $420,000. The number was so vast it was meaningless, an astronomical figure that bore no resemblance to the late nights, the missed birthdays, the life I had poured into its creation. My eyes scanned the page, searching for the validation I had long ago stopped asking for but still foolishly craved. I found the line item, lead developer. The space that followed was not just empty, it was a void, a deliberate, calculated, perfectly blank space where my name should have been. My entire professional life, 16 years of my intellectual and creative output, had been condensed into a $500 million asset and then surgically disconnected from its creator. I wasn't just uncredited, I had been uncreated. The next morning, I walked into my mother's office without knocking. The shock had burned away overnight, leaving behind a layer of icy calm. She was on the phone, her voice a smooth, persuasive melody as she negotiated some term or other with a lawyer. She held up a perfectly manicured finger, signaling for me to wait. I didn't. I walked to her desk and placed my phone on the polished surface, the screen glowing with a photo I had taken of Appendix C. She glanced down, her eyes flicking from the screen to my face. Her expression didn't change. She finished her call with a crisp, "I'll expect the revised draft by noon," and hung up. She leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her fingers. "Clara, what is the meaning of this?" "The developer credit for the JOS suite," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the seismic tremors I felt inside. "It's blank. Why was my name removed?" She let out a soft, weary sigh, the kind a parent gives a child who has just asked a deeply inconvenient and naive question. She picked up a heavy crystal paperweight, turning it over and over in her hands. "The deal with Alder & Knox is in a very delicate stage," she said, her tone maddeningly reasonable. "It's a clean sale. We're presenting the assets as wholly owned by the corporation. Attaching individual developer names just complicates the intellectual property transfer. It's standard procedure." "I'm not an individual developer," I countered, my voice hardening. "I'm your daughter, and that's my life's work." Her eyes finally met mine, and they were as cold and hard as the crystal in her hands. She placed the paperweight down with a soft, definitive click. "Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper, "you don't want to make a scene. Do you think of the family? Think of what a disruption could do to the valuation, to your father's legacy." She leaned forward, the benevolent matriarch offering a piece of wisdom. "We are on the verge of securing this family's future for generations. Don't be the one to put all of that at risk over a line of text on a piece of paper." A scene, that's what she called it. A daughter asking for recognition for her work was a scene, a threat to the deal. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I saw a stranger. There was no mother there, only a CEO protecting an asset. In her world, my identity was a liability to be managed. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply absorbed the final, brutal truth of my position. I was not family. I was infrastructure. I turned and walked out of her office without another word. The silence was my answer. She likely interpreted it as submission, as the sulking acquiescence she had relied upon my entire life. She was wrong. It was the silence of a machine being reprogrammed for a new, singular purpose. That night, I began my work. For the next 7 days, I lived a double life. By day, I was the quiet, efficient coder in the basement, closing tickets and running diagnostics as if nothing had changed. By night, I became an archivist of my own erasure. I moved through the company's digital skeleton with a ghost's precision. I copied every email I had ever sent that referenced my work on the Argent system. I pulled server logs that showed my terminal as the sole point of access for major code revisions. I unearthed early project proposals with my name on them, proposals that had been later reissued under a generic IT department heading. I compiled a mountain of digital evidence, encrypting it and transferring it piece by piece to a series of redundant, offline hard drives. The entire operation was a quiet, meticulous act of war, conducted in the hum of the servers after everyone else had gone home. My personal laptop, a machine I had bought with my own money and had never once connected to the Jensen Dynamics network, became my sanctuary and my arsenal. It was the one piece of my digital life they couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't control. Exactly 1 week after my meeting with my mother, I was called into an HR conference room. A mid-level manager I barely knew, a man named Philip, sat across the table from me, a file open before him. He couldn't meet my eyes. He mumbled something about the upcoming acquisition, about corporate synergy, about the difficult but necessary process of organizational restructuring. As such, he concluded, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. Your position has been made redundant. He pushed a thick envelope across the table. A generous severance package, he called it. All it required was my signature on a sweeping non-disclosure agreement that would forbid me from ever discussing my work at the company. They were trying to buy my silence. They thought they were closing a loop, tidying up a loose end before the big sale. I looked at the papers, at Philip's sweaty upper lip, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling calm. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I simply nodded. That night, I walked out of Jensen Dynamics for the last time. I didn't carry a box of mementos. My office had been a sterile cube, my life's work intangible. All I had was my coat and my laptop bag slung over my shoulder. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I glanced up at the top floor. I could see the silhouettes of my parents in their corner office. Looking down, I knew they were watching, relieved. They thought they had won. They thought I would take the money and disappear. Another problem solved by their immense wealth. They thought I would just bow my head. What they didn't know, what they had forgotten in their arrogance, was the document they had me sign when I was 22, a standard, boilerplate employment contract I had filed away and forgotten about myself. But in the weeks after my firing, as I sat in a small, rented apartment across town, meticulously reviewing every piece of evidence I had collected, I found my scanned copy. I read through the dense legalese, and then my eyes snagged on a single, innocuous-looking paragraph buried in the appendices. Clause 19, B. Ownership of unregistered code. My breath caught in my chest. The language was dry, but its implication was explosive. It stipulated that any and all intellectual property developed by an employee, which the company failed to formally register and attribute under the employee's name in official company records within a period of 1 year, would have its ownership rights revert to the original developer. It was a fail-safe, a standard bit of legal text intended to protect the company from claims by short-term contractors. They had never imagined it would apply to me. Their salaried, in-house, family employee. They had never bothered to formally register my authorship for anything I had ever created. Why would they? Family doesn't need signatures. In their haste to erase me, they had legally handed me the keys to their kingdom. The $420 million asset they were about to sell was not, and had never legally been, theirs to sell. It was mine. I leaned back in my chair, the contract glowing on my laptop screen. The hurt was still a cold, hard stone in my gut. But it was now surrounded by something else, a cold, clear, diamond-hard certainty. They hadn't just fired a disgruntled employee. They had armed an enemy they didn't know they had. This wasn't just a severance, it was a declaration of war. And Clause 19B was the bomb they had unwittingly let me carry out the front door. A bomb they had no idea was about to go off right in the middle of their perfect, pristine legacy. The severance check sat on the kitchen counter of my new apartment, untouched. It was a small, one-bedroom place in a sprawling, anonymous complex in the suburbs, miles from the manicured lawns and quiet old money of my parents' world. The walls were thin. The view was of a parking lot, and it was the first place that had ever felt truly mine. My previous life had been stripped away, leaving only the essentials: a bed, a table, a chair, and the humming, glowing heart of my entire operation, my personal laptop. The silence of the apartment was a luxury, a clean, sterile environment in which I could think. For the first time in my life, there were no expectations, no performances, no quiet, corrosive family duties. There was only the plan. My days fell into a monastic rhythm. I would wake before dawn, brew a pot of brutally strong black coffee, and sit at the table as the sun slowly illuminated the pages of my old employment contract. I read Clause 19B 100 times, then 1,000. I cross-referenced it with state and federal intellectual property law. I delved into legal forums and academic papers, absorbing decades of precedent regarding copyright, work-for-hire agreements, and corporate negligence. The more I read, the more the cold, beautiful certainty of it settled into my bones. My parents' mistake had been one of pure arrogance. In their world, I was a daughter, an extension of their will, not an employee with rights. They had never bothered with the simple administrative task of registering the software I created, of officially documenting its authorship. It was a clerical oversight born of a dynastic mindset, and it had created a legal loophole so vast and so perfect that I could drive their entire corporate legacy straight through it. The law was clear. The code I had written, the $420 million engine of their company, was, by their own contractual negligence, unequivocally mine. The first step was to secure the asset. I spent a week drafting the paperwork myself, translating my 16 years of silent work into the dispassionate, irrefutable language of the court. I filed for a provisional injunction and a temporary restraining order against Jensen Dynamics, citing my claim of ownership over their core digital assets. It was a preemptive strike, designed to freeze the sale to Alder and Knox and prevent my parents from transferring, selling, or altering the software in any way. I filed it electronically with the Harwood County District Court, a silent, digital declaration of war sent from my anonymous apartment. But I knew that a self-filed petition, no matter how well drafted, could be easily dismissed. I needed a veneer of professional legitimacy, a legal signature to sanctify the documents. I did not, however, want a partner. I didn't want a seasoned lawyer who would try to advise me, to counsel moderation, to angle for a settlement that would line their own pockets. I needed a tool, not a collaborator. I found him online, Alex Morton. Esco. His office was a small, rented room above a laundromat. His face in the photo on his website boyish and earnest. He'd been a licensed attorney for less than 2 years. He was perfect. I scheduled a consultation and arrived with a single, perfectly organized binder. I laid out the employment contract, the relevant legal statutes I had highlighted, and the completed injunction forms. I don't need representation, I told him, my tone flat and professional. I need you to verify the legal soundness of my interpretation of this clause, and I need you to notarize these documents and file them under your letterhead. That's all. He read through the documents, his young face a mixture of confusion and dawning astonishment. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. Ms. Jensen, if your claim is valid, this is monumental. The implications for your former employer are... I'm aware of the implications. I cut in smoothly. The question is my interpretation of the clause legally sound? He read it again, slowly, On its face, yes, it's an unusual clause to see in a standard employment contract, but the language is unambiguous. If they never registered your authorship, then yes, ownership reverts. This is an ironclad claim. Good, I said. I pushed a thick envelope across the desk. It contained $10,000 in cash. That's your fee. For your time and your signature. I will handle all correspondence with the court myself. He was a means to an end, a rubber stamp that would get my foot in the courtroom door. He took the money, his professional curiosity warring with the obvious financial incentive. In the end, the money won. He signed. With the legal trap set, it was time for the second phase of the attack. Suing them was one thing, but it would be a slow, private battle at first. I wanted to cripple them publicly. I wanted to poison the well. I needed to shatter the trust between Jensen Dynamics and their buyers. I spent an evening crafting an email. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of corporate subterfuge, using an encrypted, anonymous email service routed through a dozen foreign servers. I composed a message to the head of the Internal Audit Department at Alder & Knox. I presented myself as a concerned, high-level employee at Jensen Dynamics, a whistleblower who believed in transparency and was deeply troubled by certain irregularities in the acquisition paperwork. The tone was not accusatory, it was reluctant and grave. I would direct your attention to the executive signatures on the asset transfer agreements. I wrote, specifically, those of CEO Douglas Jensen. There are inconsistencies that suggest some documents may not have been signed by Mr. Jensen himself. I attached 2 documents. One was a legitimate contract from 5 years prior, bearing my father's clear, confident signature. The second was a recent internal memo I had found, signed by him after a long, stressful day of negotiations. His signature was hasty, slightly shaky, placed side by side. They looked subtly, damningly different. It wasn't proof of forgery, but it didn't have to be. It was a single, venomous drop of doubt. For a multi-billion-dollar corporation like Alder & Knox, whose primary vulnerability was shareholder confidence, the mere suggestion of executive fraud would be enough to trigger an avalanche. I hit send, and the digital torpedo was launched. I didn't have to wait long. Within a week, the financial news feeds I monitored began to murmur. The Alder & Knox acquisition of Jensen Dynamics, previously reported as imminent, was now on hold pending a routine internal review. I knew what that meant. An army of forensic accountants and fraud examiners were descending upon my parents' company, scrutinizing every document, every signature, every transaction. 2 weeks after my anonymous email, the court granted my injunction. Jensen Dynamics was formally served. All digital assets related to the Jensen operating system suite. Their crown jewel were legally frozen. They could not be sold, transferred, or modified. My code, the engine of their empire, had now become its cage. From my quiet apartment, I watched the shockwaves ripple outwards. I pictured the panic in the boardroom, the frantic calls between my parents and their army of lawyers. I imagined their disbelief turning to rage as they realized the author of their misfortune was not a corporate rival, but the quiet, dutiful daughter they had so carelessly discarded. They had built an empire on a foundation of my silent labor, and I had just kicked out the cornerstone with a single, perfectly placed legal filing. Now, all that was left was to wait for the court date. I did not spend this time anxiously pacing. I fell into a new routine. I went for long runs in the morning. I read novels. I learned to cook. I lived a small, quiet, ordinary life, a universe away from the corporate inferno I had ignited. The calm was absolute. My heart was a block of ice. The rage and hurt that had fueled me for months had cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a single, crystalline purpose. This was no longer about a daughter's pain or a stolen legacy. It was beyond that. I wasn't fighting for justice. Justice was a negotiation, a balancing of scales. I had no interest in balance. I wanted to witness a collapse. I wanted to sit in the front row and watch as the gleaming, perfect facade of the Jensen family was stripped away under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the public spotlight, revealing the rotten, hollow structure beneath. I didn't want them to pay me. I wanted them to pay for everything, with everything they had. The morning of the trial, I chose my armor with surgical precision. There was no power suit, no intimidating shade of black or gray. I wore a simple, high-collared blouse of the starkest white, its fabric crisp and clinical. It was the color of a blank page, of a fresh start, of empirical fact. I pulled my hair back from my face, securing it in a tight, severe knot at the nape of my neck. There would be no stray strands to soften the lines of my face, no distractions. When I looked in the mirror, the woman who stared back was a stranger I had been waiting to meet my entire life. The simmering rage that had been my constant companion for months was gone. In its place was a vast, quiet, and unnervingly calm sea of ice. My eyes were not angry. They were simply cold, the eyes of a surgeon about to make the first, necessary incision. The taxi dropped me a block from the courthouse, but I could hear the commotion before I saw it. It was a human hive, a swarm of reporters, photographers, and camera crews buzzing with a frenetic energy. They clogged the wide marble steps, a gauntlet of lenses and microphones. As I approached, a ripple went through the crowd, and then it converged on me. "Clara, is it true you're suing your own parents, Ms. Jensen? What are you hoping to get from this lawsuit? Over here. Why destroy your family's legacy?" The questions were a chaotic barrage, a wall of noise and accusation. Camera flashes popped like miniature explosions, momentarily bleaching the world white. Microphones were shoved toward my face like weapons. They saw a salacious family drama, a story of a spoiled daughter turning on her benefactors. They were hungry for tears, for a screaming match, for a soundbite that would fit neatly into their narrative of greed and betrayal. I kept my chin up and my pace steady, my eyes fixed on the courthouse doors, my white blouse a stark beacon in the sea of dark suits. Then, through the cacophony, I saw them. My parents were making their own entrance from the opposite side, flanked by a team of expensive-looking lawyers. My father was a gray ghost, his eyes downcast, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a man being led to his own execution. But my mother was in her element. She thrived in the spotlight, dressed in a deep navy blue dress that screamed authority. She wore a mask of pained maternal concern. She stopped, allowing a reporter from the city's biggest news channel to get close. And then I heard it. Her voice, perfectly modulated to carry, a performance of sorrowful resignation. "We love our daughter," she said, her voice catching with practiced emotion. "But she's been under a great deal of stress lately. We're very concerned. She's mentally unstable." The words struck me, not with the pain of a daughter being slandered, but with the detached clarity of a strategist recognizing a predictable, desperate maneuver. Unstable, the classic, final weapon against a woman who speaks a truth you don't want to hear. Discredit the source, and you discredit the message. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of the old shame, the ingrained instinct to retreat, to apologize for being a problem, but it was just a phantom limb, a twitch from a part of me that was already dead. I saw her for what she was, a cornered animal, lashing out with the only weapon she had left. My father, as always, remained silent. His silence was his contribution, his eternal, passive complicity in her cruelty. He stood beside her, a pillar of tacit agreement. One of the reporters turned to me, shoving a microphone forward. "Ms. Jensen, your mother says you're unstable. Do you have a response?" I stopped. The entire scrum of bodies seemed to hold its breath. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at my father. I found the unblinking red light of a television camera, a direct feed to the entire city. I let the silence hang for a beat, letting my cold, steady gaze be the first part of my answer. Then I spoke. My voice was low, clear, and cut through the noise like a shard of glass. Let the document speak. That was all. I turned and continued my walk up the steps, the crowd parting before me as if I had erected a force field. The phrase was a promise and a dismissal. It told them this wasn't about my mental state. It wasn't about family drama. It was about evidence, about contracts, about the cold, hard, irrefutable truth printed in black and white. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed behind me, shutting out the noise and the flashing lights. The sudden, muffled silence was a relief, and in that quiet, I felt a strange and unexpected sensation, a feeling of lightness. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized had been hunched for 16 years under the weight of an unspoken truth, felt suddenly unburdened. My heart wasn't pounding with anxiety. My hands weren't shaking. I felt a profound and liberating sense of peace. Because I finally understood, this wasn't a family lawsuit. I wasn't here to air grievances or seek emotional closure. Families are messy, complicated, and bound by love and obligation. The entity I was fighting wasn't my family. It was a corporation that had worn a family's face. This lawsuit wasn't a desperate cry for help. It was a clinical, procedural act. It was the filing of a death certificate for a lie that I had helped keep alive for far too long. The lie of the perfect Jensens. The lie of our family dynasty. The lie that my silence was a form of love. Today, I was simply the executor of that lie's estate. I walked into the courtroom and took my place at the plaintiff's table. I scanned the gallery, the rows of public seating filled with journalists and the curious elite of Harwood. And then I saw them. Scattered amongst the crowd, almost invisible, were a few familiar faces. There was Maria, a quiet accountant from the third floor, who I knew had been passed over for promotion 3 times in favor of my father's golf buddies. There was Ben, a brilliant junior coder from my old department who I'd watched have his best ideas stolen and presented by his manager. Their eyes met mine. They didn't wave or make a grand gesture. They just gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a faint, secret smile. In that instant, I knew I wasn't alone. They understood. They had lived in the shadow of the same lie, in a corporate culture built on credit stealing and nepotism, all masked by my mother's performance of benevolent leadership. My fight was not just my own. It was a silent rebellion on behalf of every anonymous staff coder, every overlooked employee who had ever poured their talent into Jensen Dynamics only to watch someone else take the credit. A sense of profound resolve settled over me. This was right. This was necessary. I arranged my few belongings on the table, a glass of water, a pen, and the thick, white binder that contained the truth. The judge entered. The bailiff called for us to rise, and the proceedings began. The room was silent, waiting. I reached out, my hand steady, and placed my fingers on the cover of the binder. With a soft click, I unfastened the rings. The sound was small, but in the quiet of the courtroom, it felt as loud and final as a chambered round. I opened the file. The real story was about to begin. The preliminary motions were a blur of legalese, a dull but necessary prelude to the main event. My parents' lead counsel, a man named Arthur Davenport, with a mane of silver hair and a voice as smooth and rich as aged whiskey, rose to his feet. He was the kind of lawyer who exuded an unshakable confidence, a man paid a fortune to make inconvenient truths disappear. He began his opening statement with a tone of paternalistic regret. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom, "this is a deeply unfortunate family matter, a tragedy, in many ways. While my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, have nothing but love for their daughter, this lawsuit is, to be frank, baseless. It is a work of fiction born of a personal grievance." He paced slowly before the judge's bench, his movements practiced and theatrical. The facts are simple. The plaintiff, Ms. Clara Jensen, was an employee of Jensen Dynamics. As a condition of her employment, she signed a comprehensive contract, a contract which, in no uncertain terms, assigns any and all intellectual property she developed during her tenure to the company. It is a standard work-for-hire agreement. It is airtight. It is absolute. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We have submitted a copy of this signed contract as Exhibit A. It is the beginning and the end of this matter. Ms. Jensen willingly and with full understanding, signed away her rights. For her to now claim ownership of corporate assets is not just misguided, it is a breach of the very contract she now seeks to weaponize. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a kind of professional pity. We asked the court to dismiss this case, to put an end to this painful and frivolous spectacle. He sat down. A murmur went through the gallery. I could feel the confidence in the room shift toward him. His argument was simple, logical, and backed by what everyone assumed was a standard, unassailable document. Judge Albright looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Ms. Jensen, your response." I stood up. My legs felt steady. My hands were still. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and even. "Mr. Davenport is correct. I did sign an employment contract." I saw a flicker of a triumphant smile on my mother's face. She thought I was about to concede. However, I continued, "The copy submitted by the defense as Exhibit A is incomplete." Davenport shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That is the complete, fully executed document from Ms. Jensen's personnel file." "Overruled," the judge said, her eyes fixed on me. "Explain yourself, Ms. Jensen." "The defense has submitted the main body of the contract," I said, my voice gaining strength, "but they have omitted the addenda. Specifically, Appendix B, page 14. May I approach with my copy?" The judge nodded. I picked up my binder, the white, three-ringed weapon, and walked toward the bench. I could feel every eye in the room on me. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at their lawyers. I looked only at the judge. I opened the binder to a page marked with a stark red tab. "This is my personal copy of the contract, signed on the same day as theirs," I explained, pointing. "As you can see, it includes Appendix B, which both parties initialed on every page. And within that appendix, on page 14, is Clause 19B. It is entitled, Ownership of Unregistered Code." I slid the open binder under the judge's nose. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the paragraph I had indicated. "Clause 19B, I said, my voice now loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "stipulates that any intellectual property developed by an employee, which the company fails to formally register and attribute under that employee's name in official corporate records within 1 calendar year of its implementation, shall have all ownership rights and titles revert to the original developer. Jensen Dynamics never registered my authorship for a single line of code I wrote in 16 years. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound you could feel the pressure of it in your ears. Davenport stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at his partners, who began shuffling frantically through their own copy of the contract, their faces a mask of dawning horror. They had never read the fine print. Then, from the front row, a sound. My mother was on her feet, her face a storm cloud of fury. Her voice, no longer smooth and controlled, was a sharp, ugly shriek. "That's absurd." That clause was obsolete. It was boilerplate nonsense. "Mrs. Jensen," Davenport hissed, turning to her with a look of pure panic. But the damage was done. Her outburst was not a legal argument. It was a confession. She knew the clause existed. Judge Albright's gavel came down with a crack that made everyone flinch. "Mrs. Jensen, you will sit down and you will remain silent, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. Do you understand?" My mother sank back into her seat, her face pale, her mask of composure shattered. The judge turned her cold, analytical gaze back to the document. "Obsolete or not, Mrs. Jensen," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "it is part of a legally executed contract. It is still legally binding." That was the first blow. The legal foundation of their defense had just crumbled to dust. But I wasn't finished. The contract gave me the right. Now, I would show them the intent. "Your Honor," I said, returning to my table, "the defense claims this was a simple oversight. I would now like to present evidence to the contrary. I would like to show that the erasure of my name was not an act of negligence, but a deliberate, calculated corporate policy, directed from the very top, I connected my laptop to the courtroom's projector. A moment later, an image filled the large screen on the wall, an email writ large for all to see. The sender, Vivian Jensen. The recipient, the head of the IT department. The date 3 years prior, just before a major software audit. The subject line was simple metadata cleanup. I read the body of the email aloud, my voice a monotone, letting the words themselves deliver the venom. Before the auditors arrive, I want to ensure all proprietary code is clean. Go through the source of the Argent system and all its subroutines. I want you to scrub all individual developer tags and comments. Remove any metadata that references Clara Jensen by name. It is imperative that the code appears as a singular, indivisible corporate asset. Ensure this is completed by end of day. A collective gasp went through the gallery. This wasn't an oversight. This was an order. This was proof of a conspiracy to erase my existence from my own work. I clicked to the next slide. It was a reply from the IT head, confirming the task was complete. Then the next, an email from 2 years before that, with a similar directive, and another, a chain of them, a documented, 16-year history of my systematic erasure, all under the direct command of my mother. The courtroom was utterly silent now. The only sound was the quiet hum of the projector. I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at the floor. His head bowed so low his chin was nearly touching his chest. His shoulders were slumped, his entire body a portrait of shame. He could not bring himself to look at me. He could not face the physical proof of the betrayal he had silently enabled for my entire life. I turned from him and faced the judge. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the stillness. They taught me my entire life that the most important thing was to protect the family, to protect the name. And I did. I paused, then turned my head just enough to look directly at my parents. I protected it, from them. Judge Albright looked from the screen, to my father's bowed head, to my mother's frozen, ashen face. She had seen everything she needed to see. She didn't need closing arguments. The evidence was absolute, the intent undeniable. She folded her hands, her expression grim. Based on the evidence presented to this court, she declared, her voice ringing with finality, "It is clear that the plaintiff, Ms. Clara Jensen, is the sole and legal owner of the intellectual property in question, as per the terms of the binding contract. Exhibit B, the injunction is made permanent. Ownership is hereby ordered transferred, in its entirety, to the plaintiff." The words landed, ownership transferred. My mother made no sound. She simply sat there, staring into space, a statue carved from ice. But my father, he finally looked up, his eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a despair so profound it was almost black, found mine. His voice was a hoarse, broken whisper, a question that held the weight of a shattered world. "What have you done?" I looked at my father, the CEO, the patriarch, the ghost who had haunted my life with his inaction, and I gave him the answer he would never understand. Built my own name. The gavel's echo was still hanging in the air as I walked out of the courtroom, a silent, vibrating hum that seemed to follow me. I moved through a world that had suddenly turned to slow motion, the frantic scrambling of my parents' legal team, the stunned, wide-eyed faces in the gallery, the bailiff holding open the heavy door. It all felt distant, like a scene viewed through thick glass. The moment I stepped back onto the courthouse steps, the world exploded back into full speed. The wall of media I had faced that morning had doubled in size, and their energy was now a ravenous, frenzied roar. "Clara, how does it feel? What's next for the company? A victory for the little guy." The narrative had already flipped. I was no longer the unstable, traitorous daughter. I was David, and I had just slain 2 Goliaths. I said nothing. My face was a blank mask. I let the security guards form a wedge and guide me through the sea of bodies. My eyes fixed on a point in the distance. The sounds and flashes were meaningless static. I was an empty vessel, a hollowed-out success. The contents of my life having been poured out onto the courtroom floor for all to see. I made it to a waiting car, the one Alex Morton had arranged, and the door slammed shut, cutting off the noise with a heavy, satisfying thud. As the car pulled away, I glanced at my phone. It was already beginning. A news alert from a financial wire service trading on Jensen Dynamics. JDN halted pending news. The real verdict was about to be delivered, not by a judge, but by the cold, unforgiving calculus of the market. By the time I reached my small, quiet apartment, trading had resumed. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't need to hear the breathless commentary of the pundits. I just sat on my sofa, my laptop open, and watched the numbers bleed. It was a massacre in real time. The stock, which had opened that morning at a healthy $63 a share, was in a free fall. The graph on the screen was a sheer, vertical cliff, down 10%, 20, 40. I watched billions of dollars of market capitalization, the sum total of my parents' life's work, their ambition, their social standing evaporate into the digital ether. Within 4 hours of the judge's ruling, the stock price of Jensen Dynamics bottomed out at $17 and change, a 72% drop. It wasn't a correction. It was a disembowelment. An hour later came the next domino, the one I had been waiting for. Alder and Knox released an official press statement. It was a masterpiece of corporate self-preservation. It expressed deep concern over the unforeseen legal revelations that had emerged. It announced, with profound regret, that due to the significant and material legal risks now associated with Jensen Dynamics' core assets, they were officially terminating their acquisition offer. Effective immediately. They didn't mention me by name. They didn't have to. The message was clear. The Jensen family was radioactive. Their perfect, gleaming legacy was now a toxic asset to be avoided at all costs. The headlines followed. A digital tidal wave. The Harwood Gazette: Jensen empire crumbles as daughter reclaims $420 million software. Bloomberg: the clause that killed a dynasty. Forbes: how one coder brought her family's company to its knees. They painted me as a legal genius, a wronged visionary, a corporate slayer. They analyzed my strategy. They speculated on my motives, but none of them understood the truth. They saw it as an act of acquisition. They didn't realize it was an act of demolition. I closed the news tabs. The noise was overwhelming, and yet none of it touched me. I felt no thrill of victory, no savage satisfaction. I had set out to burn down a corrupt kingdom, and I had succeeded. Now I was just standing in the ashes, feeling nothing but the cold. I almost didn't check my email. I expected it to be a deluge of hate mail, of threats from shareholders, of sanctimonious lectures from distant relatives. But when I opened my inbox, it was something else entirely. There were hundreds of messages. I clicked on the first one. It was from Maria, the accountant. The body of the email contained only 2 words. Thank you. I clicked the next. It was from Ben, the young coder. 3 words this time. You finally did it. Thank you. I kept clicking, one after another. The messages poured in from email addresses I recognized, from people who, like me, had been a part of the silent, unacknowledged machinery of the company, from administrative assistants and warehouse managers, from junior marketing associates and security guards. Some told small stories of being passed over, of having their ideas dismissed, of feeling invisible. Others simply contained that same powerful 2-word message. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Over 200 of them, a chorus of whispers, a collective sigh of relief from the ghosts in the machine. They weren't congratulating me on my victory. They were thanking me for finally telling the truth, for showing the world that the gleaming facade of Jensen Dynamics was built on a foundation of countless, small erasures, mine being only the largest and most flagrant, a single, hot tear. The first I had shed in months, traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of joy. It was a tear of recognition. I hadn't been alone in that basement after all. The final pieces of the old world fell away in the days that followed. A terse press release announced that Douglas Jensen had resigned from the board of directors for personal health reasons. I saw a paparazzi photo of him online, looking frail and old, a man hollowed out by his own inaction. A week later, a small article in the business section noted that the SEC had opened a formal investigation into Vivian Jensen for the willful falsification of corporate records. Citing the emails I had displayed in court as primary evidence, the Queen had been checkmated. The Jensen family had lost control. The company they had built, the name they had worshipped, was no longer theirs. It was a shattered wreck, and I was now the sole owner of its still beating heart. And in the silence of my apartment, after the last email was read and the last headline was digested, I waited for a feeling to arrive. Triumph, grief, anger, regret, anything, but nothing came. There was no elation in my victory, no sorrow in my loss. I didn't laugh, I didn't cry. There was only a profound and bottomless silence. It was in that silence that I understood the final truth. You can't mourn a death that happened years ago. The entity I had called my family hadn't died in that courtroom. It had died in 1,000 small, quiet moments over the course of my life. It died in the condescending smiles, in the credit that was never given, in the cold, transactional nature of their love. It died when my mother taught me that a legacy was more important than a daughter, and when my father taught me that his silence was the price of his peace. The courtroom wasn't a murder, it was just a public burial. What I had done was simply sweep away the glittering, hollow shell of a thing that was already dead. And now, in the aftermath, after all the lies and performances had been burned away, only one thing was left standing: the truth. It wasn't warm, it wasn't comforting, but it was solid, and for the first time in my life, I had something real to stand on. It was an hour after the world had shattered. I was in a small, sterile waiting room, watching the dust motes dance in the slanted afternoon light, when Alex Morton found me. He looked exhausted but energized, the thrill of the victory still coursing through him. "They want to see you," he said, his voice low. Your parents. Their counsel just requested a private meeting, in one of the conference rooms. You don't have to go. You don't owe them anything." I considered it for a moment. My first instinct was to refuse, to make the courtroom the final, clean amputation, but a different thought surfaced, cold and clear. An executioner does not leave before the sentence is fully carried out. This was the final punctuation mark, the period at the end of a long and terrible sentence. "I'll go," I said, "alone." The conference room was on the 3rd floor, a place of forced, uncomfortable truce where lawyers hashed out settlements. It was aggressively neutral, with beige walls, a long, polished mahogany table, and a water cooler humming in the corner. Late afternoon sun streamed through the wide window, but the blinds were angled down, slicing the light into stark, golden bars that striped the table, the floor, and the faces of the 2 people who were already waiting for me inside. They looked like prisoners in their own gilded cage. My mother sat at the far end of the table, her back ramrod straight, a feat of muscle memory rather than actual strength. The impeccable navy blue dress she wore now seemed too big. Her posture a brittle defense against a collapse I could see waiting just beneath the surface. Her hands were clasped on the table, and I could see a fine, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers. The Queen was in her counting house, but all the money was gone. My father sat beside her, but a few feet away, a human satellite who had drifted out of orbit. He was staring at the wood grain of the table as if it held the secrets to the universe. He didn't look up when I entered. I closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch echoing in the heavy silence. I did not sit. I remained standing, my binder still clutched in my hand like a shield, and waited. It was my mother who finally broke the silence. She raised her head, and for the first time, I saw her without her armor. Her face was a ruin. The carefully constructed mask of maternal concern and corporate power had crumbled, leaving behind something raw and bewildered. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her skin looked thin, almost translucent in the harsh, striped light. When she spoke, her voice, once a tool of precision and command, was a fragile, trembling thing. "What did you get out of this?" she asked. The question was a ghost of her former self, a reflex from a lifetime of viewing the world as a series of transactions, of wins and losses. She wasn't asking about my pain or my reasons. She was asking what I had gained, what the prize was. She could not comprehend an action that was not motivated by acquisition. She was looking at the ashes of her life's work and trying to calculate my profit margin. I looked at her, at the wreckage of her certainty, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold distance. My answer was not for her, not really. It was for me. It was the mission statement I had never known I had. To stop calling betrayal loyalty, I said. My voice was quiet, even, a clinical diagnosis of the sickness that had defined our lives. The words hung in the air between us, stark and unforgiving. For a moment, I thought she might break, that the raw truth of it would finally shatter her completely. Instead, a strange and terrible thing happened. She laughed. It was not a sound of mirth or even hysteria. It was a dry, brittle, rattling sound, like stones in a tin can. It was the laugh of a ghost, thin and weak and full of dust. "Oh, Clara," she rasped, shaking her head slowly. "You're more like me than you think." It was her final move on the board, her last, desperate gambit. She was trying to claim me, to pull me down into the wreckage with her by naming me as her heir. If she could make me believe we were the same, then my victory was also her victory. My strength, a reflection of her own. It was the ultimate act of psychological appropriation. But the spell was broken. I could see the strings now. I looked straight into her tired, defeated eyes, and I did not let her hold my gaze. I took it. "No," I said, the word as sharp and clean as a scalpel's cut. "We are nothing alike. I write my name. You erase it." The distinction was absolute. It was the difference between light and shadow, between creation and annihilation. I was the architect. She was the demolitions expert. My entire life had been an act of assertion against her relentless, quiet campaign of nullification. Her weak laughter died in her throat. There was no response to that. It was the simple, elemental truth. The room fell back into silence, thicker and heavier this time. The bars of light on the wall had begun to creep higher as the sun sank toward the horizon. Then, from the sidelines, the ghost spoke. My father, who had remained a statue of gray flannel and regret, finally stirred. He didn't look at me. He continued to stare at the table, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, as if he were delivering a eulogy for himself. "We made you strong," he said. It was, I realized, the most pathetic and revealing thing he had ever said. It was his desperate attempt to reframe the story, to cast himself not as a silent, complicit coward, but as a forge. He needed to believe that his neglect and my mother's cruelty were part of some grand, deliberate plan to temper me into steel. He was trying to take credit for the strength I had been forced to build in order to survive him. A deep, profound weariness washed over me. I was tired of their stories, of their self-deceptions. I was tired of the whole, rotten charade. My reply was not for him, but for the silent, watchful girl who still lived somewhere inside me. I spoke the words softly, a final correction to the historical record. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You didn't make me strong. You made me cold." And with that, it was over. There was nothing left to say. No arguments to be won. No apologies to be heard. No peace to be made. I had come for a burial, and the body was in the ground. I turned. I did not offer a final glance, a parting word, a gesture of farewell. To do so would have been to admit there was still something left to say goodbye to. They were no longer my problem. They were just two strangers in a room, trapped in the fading light of a day that had destroyed them. My hand was on the doorknob. The scrape of my chair as I had stood was the only sound. I opened the door and stepped out into the empty, echoing hallway. The door clicked shut behind me, a sound of absolute finality. I began to walk. The hallway was paved in cool, gray stone that amplified the sound of my footsteps. Click, clack, click, Clack, the rhythm was steady, solitary, and moving forward. The sound echoed in the vast, empty space, the only sound in my new world. And everything, absolutely everything, ended there. That evening, as a soft, persistent rain began to fall, I drove back into the city. The streets were slick with water, reflecting the neon signs and traffic lights in long, shimmering strokes of color. The world outside the car was a beautiful, chaotic blur, a river of light and motion. Inside, there was only a profound stillness. I drove not to my small apartment, but to the gleaming, dark tower of Jensen Dynamics. The building that had been my gilded cage, my workplace, my family's monument to itself, was now just a building, a piece of property, my property. The lobby was empty, the cavernous space silent save for the whisper of the ventilation system. The night security guard, a man I'd known for years, looked up from his desk, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. He simply nodded as I badged myself in with a new keycard, one with unrestricted, system-wide access. The soft beep of the accepted card was the quietest and most significant sound of the day. I didn't take the elevator to the executive suites on the top floor. Not yet. I took it down into the climate-controlled chill of the basement, the digital heart of the company, where I had spent 16 years of my life in quiet, fluorescent-lit anonymity. The door to my old office was ajar. I pushed it open. The room was just as I had left it, only coated in a thin, uniform layer of dust. The desk where I had written millions of lines of code, the desk they had unceremoniously cleared and ordered removed, was back in its place, a blank, empty stage. I walked to it, my footsteps the only sound in the subterranean silence. I didn't sit. I placed my personal laptop on the smooth, cool surface, the same laptop that had served as my ark and my arsenal. I lifted the screen, and the familiar soft glow of the display illuminated my face in the darkness. I connected to the network, and opened a direct command line interface to the system's core administrative controls. My fingers, moving with an old and familiar grace, typed a single command, a query for the system's registered ownership credentials. I pressed enter. For a moment, a cursor blinked, suspended in the black void of the screen. Then, a new line of stark, white text appeared. Owner C. Jensen. It wasn't a title, it wasn't a designation, it was a fact, a fundamental, unalterable truth that was now hard-coded into the very DNA of the machine I had created. The system, in its cold binary logic, was acknowledging its creator. The ghost had returned to the machine, not as a phantom, but as its god. I closed the laptop. My work in the basement was done. I left the empty office, my old ghost self, behind for good, and took the elevator all the way to the top. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway to the corner suite, my mother's office. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the faint, cloying scent of her perfume, the last lingering trace of a vanquished queen. My binder, the one I had carried out of the courthouse, was sitting on her vast, empty desk where my lawyer had left it for me. I ignored it all and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the room. I found the latch and pushed. A pane of glass swung open, and the city rushed in the cool, damp air. The smell of rain on concrete, the soft, rhythmic hiss of tires on wet pavement. Below me, the city was a breathtaking tapestry of light. A million windows glowed with shades of gold and white. Headlights and taillights flowed in rivers of red and silver. The entire metropolis was a vast, living circuit board, pulsing with energy, every point of light a node in a network I could suddenly, fully comprehend. A gust of wind, fresh and clean with the scent of the storm, swirled into the room. It caught the pages of the open binder on the desk, riffling through them with a sound like whispered secrets. A few loose sheets were lifted into the air, dancing for a moment in the eddying currents. They scattered across the plush carpet like fallen leaves. Most slid to a stop in the shadows, but one single, white page was carried by the draft and came to rest directly in front of my feet, the text illuminated by the city lights filtering through the window. I bent down and picked it up. My fingers traced the familiar heading, Clause 19b, the obscure paragraph of legalese that had been the key, the fulcrum upon which my entire world had turned. It was the weapon I had used to win the war. I looked at it for a long moment, this piece of paper that had held so much power, this relic from a dead and buried conflict. Then, I slowly, deliberately, folded it into a neat, small square. I slipped it into the pocket of my coat. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. A historical artifact. Because the truth was, I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need the contract, the emails, the binders full of evidence to prove who I was or what was mine. I no longer needed the proof. I was the proof. My victory wasn't written on that piece of paper. It was in the steady beat of my own heart, in the quiet confidence of my own mind. It was in the code that I knew better than any person, and in the name that was now inextricably, legally, and spiritually bound to it. The paper was just an echo of a battle that was already won. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the rain fall. The fat and heavy drops slid down the glass, each one catching and refracting the 1,000 points of light from the city below. They traced intricate, intersecting paths, a cascade of glowing, liquid characters, a cryptic, beautiful language. It looked like source code, a living, breathing program written in light and water, running across the face of the world. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a quiet that went deeper than the silence of the empty building. The war was over. The fight was done. The disparate, broken pieces of my identity, the daughter, the ghost, the coder, the plaintiff had finally been brought together. In that quiet, rain-washed moment, looking out at a world that finally seemed to reflect the one inside me, I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that I had done more than win a company. I had taken the frayed and severed threads of my own name, and I had stitched them back together, firmly and forever. A month went by, a month of silence, of attorneys, of the methodical, unglamorous work of dismantling one corporate structure and building another in its place. The world moved on, as it always does. The financial news found new scandals, new collapses, new meteoric rises. The story of the Jensens faded from the headlines, becoming another piece of local business lore. And in that quiet, I began to work. I sat in the corner office on the top floor, not as a conqueror on a throne, but as a coder at a new terminal. I began the long, complex process of untangling my own code, of understanding the massive, intricate machine I had built, and of deciding what it would become. Then came the call, a primetime interview with a respected journalist, a woman known for her incisive questions and her refusal to be spun. My board of advisors, a new group of sharp, sensible people I had hired, told me it was a necessary final step, to control the narrative, to define myself in the public eye before others did it for me. I agreed, not for the public, but for myself. It was time to close the book. The television studio was a universe of controlled chaos. Technicians moved in the shadows, lights as hot and bright as miniature suns beat down, and in the center of it all was a set designed to look like a comfortable, intimate living room. It was the most artificial environment I had ever been in. I sat in a low armchair, wearing a simple, dark gray dress. The journalist, a woman named Elise Vance, sat opposite me. She was warm, professional, and had eyes that missed nothing. We spoke for 20 minutes about the company, about the future of the software, about my plans for a new corporate culture built on transparency and merit. I answered her questions calmly, precisely. Speaking about code and systems and efficiency, I could feel her gently probing, trying to get past the corporate shield and into the family drama she knew her audience craved. Finally, she made her move. "I have to ask," she said, her tone softening. "The media has portrayed this as a David and Goliath story, a daughter's rebellion. When you look back at that day in the courtroom, at the moment your mother—" She trailed off, letting the unspoken accusation hang in the air. I knew the soundbite she was fishing for. She wanted pain, anger, a tearful recollection. I gave her the truth instead. I remember walking into the courtroom, I said, my voice even, and I remember the moment they saw me. They laughed. The memory was clear, not as a wound, but as a data point. My mother's quiet, sharp laugh, my father's dismissive shake of the head. It was the inciting incident, the line of code that had initiated the entire program. Elise leaned forward, sensing she was close to the heart of it. And what did you think in that moment? I held her gaze. I did not blink. I let the silence stretch for a beat, letting the heat of the lights bake my skin. I thought of the 16 years in the basement, of the erased name, of the cold, dismissive finality in my mother's office. I thought of everything they had tried to make me into a ghost, a tool, a function, and I thought of the single, driving force that had emerged from the ashes of that life. They laughed, I repeated, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. So I built something that can't be laughed at. The control room must have known they had their moment. A small red light on the camera directly in front of me lit up, indicating a close-up. My face would be filling a million television screens. The bright white studio light reflected in my eyes. Two sterile, burning points. In that reflection, there was no anger, no pain. There was only the unshakable, dispassionate truth of a builder. You cannot laugh at a mountain. You cannot laugh at a system that works. You cannot laugh at a fact. My work, my name, my company. They were now facts. Elise was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of my statement settle. She knew she had her headline. She had one last question, the personal one, the one that was meant to provide the emotional closure for her television audience. "Do you still have any contact with them?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost a whisper. "With your parents." The question was about them, but my answer was about me. It was about the silence I had earned, the peace I had fought for. "No," I said simply. Then I added the rest of the truth. "But I hear their silence." The silence was their absence from my life, from my thoughts, from my future. It was the vast, quiet space where their criticisms and manipulations used to be. Their silence was the sound of my freedom, and it was the loudest, most beautiful sound in the world. The interview ended. I walked out of the studio and into the cool night air. As if on cue, a light drizzle began to fall. I hailed a cab and rode back to the office tower, my tower. I stood across the street for a moment, under the awning of a closed shop. The rain was picking up now, the drops tapping a soft, steady rhythm on the fabric above me. I opened my umbrella, a simple, black one, and tilted it against the wind as I prepared to cross the street. The angle of the umbrella, the falling rain, the looming glass and steel of the building, the image was a perfect, haunting echo of the night I had been fired. The same scene, the same actress, but the story had been completely rewritten. As I waited for the light to change, a woman who had been standing nearby, also sheltering from the rain, turned to me. She was a stranger, her face kind and etched with the lines of a life lived. She must have recognized me from the news. "You're brave," she said, her voice a soft, admiring murmur against the sound of the rain. I looked at her, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. It was a small smile, not of triumph, but of peace, of completion, the word she used. Brave implied a struggle, a continuing fight against fear, but the fight was over. The fear was gone. "No," I replied, my voice gentle. "Just done." The light changed. I stepped off the curb and walked toward my building. The camera of my memory pulled back, rising high above the street. It showed a lone figure with a black umbrella crossing a rain-slicked street toward a skyscraper, and on the side of that skyscraper, a massive electronic ticker was scrolling through the day's market data. It paused, and a new message scrolled across in bright, white, luminous letters, glowing against the dark, stormy sky. Jensen Software, owned by Clara Jensen. My name, in lights, indelible. The image held for a long moment, then, slowly, it faded to black. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. And if you'd like to help this story be heard by more people, please support us by hitting that hype button. It makes all the difference.